Have you ever imagined a day when the most fortified walls, the very soul of Christianity, could be torn apart by hoofbeats, swords, and blood? Could you picture a city where thousands of pilgrims once walked in awe, suddenly falling into the hands of its enemies in mere days? In 1187, the name Jerusalem, sacred to millions of Christians, Jews, and Muslims, no longer belonged to the Crusaders. After nearly a century under Western control, the holy city fell. But this fall was not just a military defeat. It was the end of a dream, a tragedy wrapped in the hymns of a blood-stained faith. And at the center of this turning point was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known as Saladin. To the Muslim world, he was the liberator of Jerusalem. To the Christian West, he was a nightmare in a white robe, calm, brilliant, and unstoppable. To understand how Jerusalem fell, we must go back to the end of the 11th century, when cries of Deus vult, God wills it, swept across Europe. The First Crusade was born. Thousands left their plows, families, and homes to march toward the east in what they believed was a divine mission. In 1199, Crusaders took Jerusalem after a horrifying massacre. The city became the capital of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Christian state planted in the heart of the Islamic world. But this fragile peace was always doomed. For nearly 90 years, Jerusalem stood on borrowed time, surrounded by enemies and split from within. Then, in 1187, Saladin came, not as a conqueror, but as a force of purpose. He was not simply a man of war, but a man of unity. His mission, to reclaim what he believed belonged to Islam. The fall of Jerusalem would not be just another battle. It would spark the Third Crusade, sending kings like Richard, the Lionheart, and Frederick Barbarossa marching east. But this story isn't only about kings and warriors. It's about monks, peasants, children, and the unknown soldiers whose lives were consumed by a war of faith. Each had a belief, a fate, and all were swept into the crushing gears of history. So, how did the Crusaders lose Jerusalem? Who was Saladin, hero or foe? And what price did the Holy War extract from both sides? This journey will take you from the bloodied fields of Hattin to the trembling walls of Jerusalem and deep into the heart of an age built on conviction and chaos. Saladin wasn't born a legend. He was a Kurd, born in Tikrit, a modest town along the Tigris River, raised under the shadow of endless wars between rival Islamic dynasties. But from that rough soil, a man with steel resolve and unwavering faith would one day rise, not just to challenge the Crusaders, but to unite an entire world behind him. By the time Jerusalem stood trembling behind its walls, Saladin wasn't just a general. He was a symbol, a force, a man who ended centuries of infighting and fragmentation in the Muslim world. Under his command, Egypt and Syria stood together. For the first time in decades, the Islamic world had a single voice, and it spoke with clarity: reclaim Jerusalem. But what made Saladin truly remarkable wasn't only the battles he won. It was the way he chose to fight. He forbade the slaughter of civilians. He protected Christian holy sites. He ransomed captives, offered water to enemies, and showed mercy when none was expected. In an age where cruelty was standard, Saladin made compassion a strategy, and it changed everything. Across the walls, however, unity was crumbling. The Crusaders had once marched in faith. But now, after years of rule in the Holy Land, they had splintered. When King Baldwin IV, the Leper King, died, he left behind a fragile kingdom. His successor, Guy of Lusignan, lacked the wisdom or strength to lead. Worse, He was influenced by dangerous zealots like Renaud de Chatillon, a warlord who raided Muslim caravans and broke every truce, provoking Saladin to the breaking point. Their recklessness was the spark that lit the fire. In July 1187, Saladin crushed the Crusader army at Hattin. The field turned red. The Holy Cross was captured. Guy was taken prisoner. Renaud was executed by Saladin himself. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a reckoning. And as Jerusalem stood nearly defenseless, one man rose to defend it. Not a king, not a prince, but a minor noble, Balian of Ibelin. He hadn't planned to fight. In fact, he had already left the city after Hattin. But upon hearing that his wife, his children, and thousands of civilians were trapped behind Jerusalem's walls, he asked Saladin for safe passage to rescue them. Saladin agreed, on the condition that Balian would not take up arms. But when Balian saw what was happening inside the city, he made a choice. He broke that promise, not for glory, but for those who had no one else. He gathered the few remaining knights, armed teenagers and priests, and prepared to defend the city not as a fortress, but as a home. Inside Jerusalem, life teetered on the edge. Bells still rang from the churches. Prayers still rose from the mosques. Children still played in courtyards that would soon be filled with fire. It was as if everyone knew the end was coming and chose to greet it with dignity. The city, after nearly a century under Crusader control, was never truly integrated. European nobles lived apart from local Muslims and Jews. They kept their language, their laws, their pride, and in doing so, made enemies of their neighbors. Jerusalem was strong in stone, but weak in spirit. And Saladin was ready. His army wasn't just men with swords. It was belief, discipline, and a purpose sharpened by decades of waiting. They did not march for gold or conquest. They marched for something they believed had been taken, something they swore to reclaim. And the moment was near. Summer, 1187. The winds of Galilee blew hot and dry across the land. Beneath a merciless sun, the earth cracked, the air shimmered, and water became more precious than gold. But even more precious was time. And the Crusaders had run out of it. On July 4th, the Battle of Hattin unfolded. Not in a grand fortress, but on a pair of barren hills called the Horns of Hattin. There, the Crusader army, exhausted, disorganized, and dying of thirst, was surrounded by Saladin's forces. Under the blazing sky, their armor turned to ovens. Their strength failed. Their lines shattered. It wasn't a battle. It was an unraveling. The Holy Cross was seized. King Guy was captured. Renaud de Chatillon was executed. The Crusader army was annihilated. Jerusalem was left exposed. When the news reached the city, it was like a knife to the soul. People wept. Priests rang the bells in mourning. Some packed to flee, others dug trenches, many simply knelt and prayed. No one knew when Saladin would come, but all felt it. The end was no longer a question, it was a date. Unknown, but certain. Saladin moved slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of confidence. Victory no longer required haste. He gave his army time to prepare. He let fear ferment in the hearts of his enemies. He knew they would beg for peace, and he would offer it, on his terms. On September 20th, his forces surrounded the city. Inside the walls stood only a skeleton defense, exhausted soldiers, frightened citizens, and one man trying to hold them together. Balian of Ibelin. He had just a few hundred men, mostly civilians, priests, boys with makeshift weapons. Yet somehow, they fought, not because they thought they could win, but because they had no choice. For days, Saladin's army battered the northern walls. But Jerusalem had been built strong. The stones held for a time. Inside, food dwindled. Water ran dry. Hope grew thin. People died in their cellars, suffocating beneath the weight of dread. Each night was filled with prayers and the sobs of those who knew. This city was dying. And then, Balian made a gamble. He sent a message to Saladin. He did not beg. He warned. "If you do not accept surrender under conditions," Balian wrote, "we will destroy every holy site, kill every Muslim captive, and die in fire, so that your victory will come at a cost so high, it will haunt you." Saladin paused and agreed. On October 2nd, 1187, the Christian banner came down from the city. It was the same day Muslims commemorated the Isra and Miraj, the night Prophet Muhammad was believed to have ascended to heaven from Jerusalem. The timing felt like a sign. In the golden light of evening, Saladin's flag rose above the dome of the rock. But what followed was not a massacre, not a purge, not a repeat of 1099. There was order. Saladin allowed Christians to ransom themselves. Those who couldn't afford it, he freed. Those too weak to walk, he carried. When asked why, he simply said, "Jerusalem is holy. Let it not be stained with more blood." He didn't enter as a conqueror. He entered as a man who had waited a lifetime to bring justice to a city that had bled for too long. Behind him, Jerusalem fell quiet. Some cried, but not in rage, in mourning, for a chapter had closed. The city of cathedrals and Latin chants was no more. In its place, a Jerusalem under new rule, but still breathing. Back in Europe, the shock was absolute. When Pope Urban III received the news, it said he died of grief. The bells of Christendom rang in sorrow. And soon, the call went out again. A new crusade, a third, this time led by kings. But the question still lingered. What was lost? Could it truly be taken back? When Jerusalem fell, the Holy City didn't just change hands, it shattered worlds. In Europe, the news struck like lightning through cathedrals and castles. From dusty village churches to the halls of kings, grief rippled through the continent. Some wept, some raged, some turned silent. But all asked the same question: how could God let this happen? The Holy City, the beating heart of Christendom, had been lost, and the silence from the East was deafening. Just months later, Pope Gregory VIII issued a new call, another crusade. But this time, it wasn't peasants and minor lords answering the trumpet. It was kings. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. The greatest monarchs of the age were going to war, not just to win, but to redeem an entire faith. But while swords were being sharpened and ships prepared, something else was happening in the shadows of Europe: the human cost. Thousands of widows, orphans, lost sons who never returned from the Holy Land, monasteries left empty, villages taxed to the bone to fund wars on lands they'd never see. And across it all, a slow, creeping disillusionment. People began to ask not just why, but was it worth it? Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Saladin restored order, not with fire, but with structure. Christian churches were left intact. Jews, who had been banned under Crusader rule, were allowed to return. Muslim law was reinstated, but with balance. The city became, once again, a shared space. Fragile, yes. Uneasy, but not burning. To the Muslim world, this victory was more than military. It was redemption. In Cairo, in Damascus, in Baghdad, Saladin's name was spoken like a prayer. Poets wrote of him, scholars studied him. Children were named after him. But even within the Muslim world, power breeds concern. Local dynasties watched Saladin's rise with both pride and fear. Could anyone hold so much for so long? And yet, Saladin did not crown himself emperor. He built no palace of gold. When he died, his belongings could fit in a small chest, one sword, a worn robe, and a reputation that would outlive empires. In Europe, stories began to take new shapes. Saladin was no longer just the enemy. He became something more complex, a noble adversary, a mirror. And Balian of Ibelin, though largely forgotten by history books, his defense of Jerusalem became legend among knights. A man who stayed, not for power, but for people. In his image, Europe began to imagine the ideal knight, brave, loyal, just, and merciful. These were not just battles of blood. They were battles of story, and stories last longer than flags. In time, Jerusalem became not just a place to capture, but a place to remember. A place that reminded Christians of sacrifice. A place that reminded Muslims of patience. A place that whispered to Jews of a home once lost. The city had fallen, but in falling it became more than a city. It became an idea. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 did more than close a chapter in the Crusades. It left behind echoes that still shape how East and West view faith, honor, and power. History doesn't always remember who won, but it always remembers what was learned. In Europe, the loss of the Holy City sparked reflection. The Third Crusade would come. Swords would clash. Kings would ride. But behind the banners, questions lingered. Why did we lose? What had we become? The Crusaders, once pilgrims of purpose, had turned into rulers of a foreign land, aloof, arrogant, and divided. Their failure wasn't just at Hattin or Jerusalem. It began years earlier, in courtrooms, in greed, in forgotten humility. For some, that loss forced a spiritual reckoning. For others, it became legend. Across castles and monasteries, tales of Balian of Ibelin were whispered, a knight who stayed not for glory, but to protect the helpless. In him, the West found the image of what a knight should be. Not just a warrior, but a guardian. Not just brave, but noble. And in Saladin, they saw something rare. A Muslim ruler who fought without hatred, who spared his enemies, who honored the faith of others. Over time, even Christian poets praised him. His name appeared in chivalric romances alongside Arthur and Roland, not as a villain, but as a mirror of greatness. Meanwhile, in the Muslim world, the victory became more than a military triumph. It became a moment of cultural pride. Schools flourished, trade routes revived, scholars, poets, architects, they all found new energy under the stability Saladin created. And yet, he took no throne, built no empire for his heirs. When he died, the legend says, he left behind only a worn cloak and a heart that had no room for gold, only duty. Perhaps that was the most powerful message of all, that greatness does not need monuments, only memory. Jerusalem itself became a paradox. The city was no longer a trophy, it was a symbol. For Christians, it became a place of loss and longing. For Muslims, a promise fulfilled. For Jews, a hope still out of reach. It stopped being a battlefield and became a prayer. Even today, more than 800 years later, Jerusalem still reflects that tension. Still sacred, still disputed, still deeply loved. But if the events of 1187 taught anything, it is this. Faith is not in stone walls. It's in how we rise when we fall. It's in how we treat the stranger. It's in what we choose to remember and what we dare to forgive. In the end, Jerusalem wasn't lost. It was transformed, not into a kingdom, but into a mirror. The War of 1187 didn't end with the clash of swords, but with footsteps fading into silence. Saladin did not destroy Jerusalem. He didn't raise statues to himself in the square. He didn't build triumphal arches. And somehow, that quiet ending has echoed through time, louder than any victory march ever could. Jerusalem lay still beneath a pale sky, as if it had never known blood, never heard screams. But every stone, every dome, every alley still held the ghost of those who lived and died for something they believed to be holier than life itself. The Third Crusade came, as promised. Richard the Lionheart marched east, blazing with fire and resolve. He won battles, but he could not win Jerusalem. And in the end, he made peace, not from weakness, but from understanding. He knew a city can be taken, but it can never truly be held, not when its power lives in the hearts of so many. Jerusalem became something else, a wound that became a symbol, a loss that became memory, a failure that became sacred. And ironically, it was through its fall that Jerusalem became untouchable. No longer a fortress for one faith, but a home longed for by many. Not a place to control, but a place that called out. This may be its greatest legacy. It taught the world that faith doesn't live in relics or walls. It lives in how we treat each other, even in war, even in loss. And this is not just the story of the 12th century. More than 800 years later, Jerusalem is still not at peace, still yearned for, still loved, still fought over. But if you stand there now, on the stone paths where knights once fell, and you listen closely, you may hear more than history. You may hear something holy, because maybe, just maybe, what was lost in 1187 wasn't Jerusalem. It was our understanding of what it means to win. So, next time you hear the name Jerusalem, remember, it once fell. But maybe that fall is what made it unforgettable.